We have an exciting partnership to announce before we get into today's Scuttlebutt. Scuttlebutt has been asked to join Reads Across America Radio, a 24/7 internet radio station where you can listen to veteran stories 24/7. You can find that on the iHeartRadio app. You can also find it on their website, readsacrossamerica.org. The Scuttlebutt will be featured Friday nights at 9 p.m. and Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. If you don't know anything about Reads Across America, they're an incredible organization, all dedicated to honoring veterans and those who gave all in service to our country. Check out the Scuttlebutt on their radio station and all the other programs that they have on their 24/7 radio station, again, on iHeartRadio app or readsaccrossamerica.org. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit in Western PA whose mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. You can find out everything there is to know about the VBC on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. You can become a member. You can sign up to receive our free quarterly magazine. You can find out about our Veterans History Project, our Monday night Zoom programs, everything and everything. Please visit us on the website. Today's episode of The Scuttlebutt focused really in on leadership and how to become a good leader. To speak to that, I'm joined by Pat D'Amico. He is a corporate advisor to Fortune 500 executives and CEO of About Face Development. We get into that. We get a lot into his service. And we talk a lot about leadership, becoming a good leader, how to do that, how to coach leaders to be better leaders, how to coach a team to more efficiently do their work. Pat's a great guy. I had a great conversation with him. And I was very interested to hear about how his service really inspired him to go into coaching later on in life. He has a great story and very energetic guy. I hope that you enjoy this conversation. Please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube so you're the first to know whenever we release new episodes. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. Enjoy the show. Joining me for today's episode of The Scuttlebutt is Pat D'Amico. Pat, you have a really interesting story to tell. I'm excited to dive into the successes you've had becoming a corporate advisor to the Fortune 500 executives, a lot of stuff here, and your service history. Love for you to introduce yourself. Thank you for joining me on The Scuttlebutt.
Well, thanks, Sean, and thanks for having me. I've had a very a varied career and probably a little bit not traditional, I guess I would say. But I started my career in the Army actually right after high school. I always admit I was not a good high school student. I had a good time, but when I was graduating, my parents said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to go to college." And they found that interesting and laughed because they had no money to send me, and I really didn't have any grades that were going to get me any help. So I really figured out that the Army was the route. So I enlisted after high school. Ended up competing for an Army scholarship, and ultimately ended up at Valley Forge Military Academy in the early commissioning program. So after my sophomore year, I was commissioned an officer. At that time in the reserves, I finished up my 4-year degree, and then I went on active duty. And I like to say that although the Army paid for college, they got a lot more out of me than I got out of them. It was an interesting time. It was the 89 to 94 time frame. So I was in Panama, as well as Saudi Arabia and Iraq during Desert Storm. I also did some time in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay as well, way before anybody knew where or what Guantanamo Bay was. But after that, I exited the military. It's actually been 30 years. I just celebrated my 30th year in industry. And I first went to work for Johnson & Johnson. I spent 15 years there. Started in sales, did sales management time. I did a lot of sales operations time. I ran recruiting for sales for J&J for the U.S. for a few years. And then I left J&J to go to startup as a VP of commercial operations. That was a 5-year plan that after 2 years we were bought by an organization called Medtronic, which is the largest medical device manufacturer in the world. And I spent about 8 or 10 years there, primarily at that point in my career, really focused on learning and development. And so I have a master's degree in education instructional design. I left Medtronic when I didn't want to move to Minneapolis for a promotion. So nothing against Minneapolis, but I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and I had seen enough snow for 4 lifetimes. So the last 6 or 7 years, I've been a consultant running my own business called About Face Development. There's an interesting story if you want to delve into why I call the company About Face Development. And my focus is primarily leadership and management development with Fortune 500 companies. And I also do quite a bit of individual one-on-one executive coaching. So I'm a certified coach through Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. But that's essentially what I do. I'm fortunate. I get to do what I'm passionate about, which is developing leaders and helping people reach their full potential. My mantra is every employee deserves a good manager, and there's a lot of that's lacking. So I think it's a little bit of an epidemic. So that's sort of what I do, man.
That's absolutely an epidemic. I hear you on that. Not that we at VBC I have a really wonderful manager, but I've had bad managers in my past, and couldn't be more happy that you are committed
Yeah.
to making better managers, because we absolutely need them. And I'm sure that that stems from a bit of your army experience. I want to go back to that to start, and then we can dive much more into the last 30 years of like I said, a very successful career. So you enlisted in '89.
I enlisted in 85, actually.
85. Okay.
Yeah, I enlisted right after high school, 17, and my parents signed me away. And it was an interesting because at the time, what I didn't understand was that if I enlisted with the goal of getting a scholarship in the early commissioning program, what
Mhm.
I didn't know at the time was had I not won the scholarship, I would have ended up having to go on active duty and would have had to done a full 4 years before I could go to college. It was a little unclear. I was
Right.
fortunate that I was awarded the scholarship, pretty much right away, and found myself at Valley Forge Military Academy while serving in the National Guard at the same time as an enlisted soldier.
Do you think, what did you need the most at that time, at that age? Did you need the
Oh,
discipline? Did you need the world experience? Was it kind of all of it?
so that's a great question. So my parents were shocked. I did not come from a military family. My
Mhm.
father had been in the National Guard, but he used to laugh about what that was like back when he was younger. And so it was my senior year. I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was literally in the guidance office in my high school, and I looked on the shelf, and all of the military school brochures were all together. And
Mhm.
I remember pulling out the one for, VMI and West Point, the Naval Academy, and I was like, I had been fairly disciplined. When I was disciplined from the standpoint that I woke up every day, most of my high school career at 4:30 in the morning to go work out at the gym. My brother-in-law owned a gym, and it was great. We worked out every morning before it opened, so I was disciplined that way. But I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I just was very unclear. I hadn't really thought a whole lot about it, to be frank with you.
Yeah.
And so I said, you know what, this might help me. And I knew I needed discipline around my studies.
Mm.
And there's no question when all of a sudden first of all, I was fortunate. I had leadership experience in high school that really translated well when I got to Valley Forge
Mhm.
as a cadet. But the requirement around the expectations around your studies were pretty significant and really created great study habits for me. And, frankly, my academic achievement, skyrocketed,
Yeah.
once in that setting where, I like discipline. I could be disciplined, but I'd never been disciplined in that area. So I think
Mhm.
that's really what helped me. And that's sort of what led to, then my decision to apply for regular army, go on active duty versus the option of staying, of serving out my time in the National Guard.
How different was that between National Guard and active duty? Was there a significant increase in, you know, uh, PT, responsibility, teamwork?
Yeah, so the Guard's an interesting animal, and I think it works for a lot of folks. What I learned very quickly was, of course, I went to basic training, then I went to Valley Forge and lived through the plebe system, and then lived 2 years in a fully 24-hour day military environment, and I loved it and I thrived in it. And the experience that I had in the Guard, was not as encouraging to me, I guess I would say. Just wasn't the right experience for me. And then when I left Valley Forge after my sophomore year and having gotten commissioned, I finished my degree in DC, in Washington, and I had to serve for 2 years as a platoon leader in the DC National Guard. And again, coming out of the environment of a full-time military experience, although Valley Forge was technically ROTC, it wasn't a military academy. It's still a full-time military experience. You're going to a military school. So when I left Valley Forge, I missed that tremendously. So I couldn't wait to finish up my degree and get in, and go full-time into the regular army, because it's really what I desired. I wanted that full-time experience of being fully committed to this, this purpose that I felt so, that I felt so passionate about.
You said that you had some experience like in high school with leadership. What was your leadership like in the National Guard as you started made that transition into the military? Because we know that not all leaders in the military are great as well. You know, we have some maybe rotten apples, but there are some phenomenal leaders as well that a lot of our veterans have latched onto and said, this person really set me straight. This person really gave me the right drive, really supported me.
Well, that goes to, I think, my second mentor, my first mentor in life being my father, but my second mentor, without a question, was a gentleman by the name of Sergeant Major George Deedy. He was actually a primary instructor when I was at Valley Forge, Vietnam, three-tour Vietnam vet, had been a member of the Old Guard, Tomb Guard, of the Unknown Soldier, and the 2 years I spent with him, I think he had, arguably the greatest influence on me of understanding, the importance of service, of dedication, but most importantly, the leadership lessons that he taught me. And in fact, when I was a plebe there, he taught me really what I considered my first leadership lesson that I talk about today all the time when I'm teaching, facilitating programs now in corporate America. Three lessons he told me were, first one was don't mess with people's pay. Of course, he didn't use the word mess. He used another word. It was the old Army, right? He would say, don't mess with people's pay. If somebody's got a pay problem, fix it yesterday. The idea being, look, most people do not work for charity. They want to support their families. When somebody has a pay problem, it's overriding. That was number one. Number two is don't mess with people's off time. When people are off, let them be off, right? People need their downtime. And I've really taken that lesson and I've reworked it when I'm training managers and leaders to say, not only do you need to let your people have their time off, but you need to set the right example for them. And I'll say to these folks, if you're telling your people, hey, when you're off, put an out of office on, send it my way. But then when you as a leader, if you're going on vacation and you're telling them, hey, look, I'm on vacation, but I'll be available, you're not setting the right example. They're leaving that thinking, well, you're telling me I'm off, but your expectation is really that I'm available. So those are the first two lessons. But Sean, the third lesson is, to me, has been the most important lesson and still is the most important lesson as a leader and as a developer of leaders. And that is that if your people truly believe you care about them and are looking out for their best interests, they will perform for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I am talking to potential leaders, I will say, if you are the person who gets the most excitement out of being on stage and being recognized, being a leader may not be for you, right? You have to get more, you have to be jazzed more and be more excited about watching your people succeed. Because ultimately, as a leader, your entire success is predicated on your people performing. And I firmly believe they will perform if you are looking out for them, you're trying to develop them, you're coaching them, you're doing what's right for them, that everyone succeeds. So I've carried that lesson with me. I must mention it a dozen times a month. It comes up all the time, but I've seen plenty of leaders who survive for a while being very about themselves, but eventually that comes out. But as a leader, you've just got to put the well-being and the success of your people before you ultimately do, you will have success. So
that's a fantastic lesson. Absolutely. And I love the one also about when they're off, because here in America, I mean, my wife and I talk about this because we recently had our second child, and we talk about
congratulations.
Thank you. And there definitely in the corporate America, it's like, okay, well, you just had a baby, but you can take emails, right? And it's like, no, you have to support the person who's going to be out for a little while, especially like in a childbearing case, but like this idea in America, it seems like there's just like, okay, well, you're sort of off, but you're available.
Well, and honestly, Sean, it's so funny. We're talking about this a half hour ago. I was on a call with somebody at a corporate, leader, and they were just sharing this with me. They just had their fourth child, and he was saying, I was on paternity leave, but really I wasn't on. And I think technology has been really the biggest detriment in this area, is the most impact, right? I mean, at one time, if you didn't call my home phone or if I didn't answer, I didn't have to deal with it. And now it's, we're so available all the time. And I think you really, as a leader, need to impress on people. And sometimes you really need to force people, because they're, it's not always the leader's fault, for sure. I know a lot of highly motivated employees that just can't seem to disconnect. And if I have to, I'll be harsh with them. I mean, especially if they're on vacation with their family, right? I mean, they work hard. Their family has a right to enjoy the fruits of their labor with them, not,
Hmm.
with them present, not just with them physically there.
Right. Yeah, and the whole idea of just teamwork. You're not gonna, it's not gonna be success story just you shining a light on yourself and patting yourself on the back. Like your team is there to support you and help make it all happen. That just,
Yeah.
yeah, that's brilliant. I know we just dove down a little rabbit hole here, but let's go back. What was your MOS?
So I was a 90, I was a MP. I was a military police officer.
Oh, excellent. And did you enjoy that work?
I really did. I was fortunate because I had a very, of my time I only had a very short stint of less than a year that was on the law enforcement side.
Mhm.
The majority of the time I spent in a combat support unit. And even post the invasion of Panama, although we were technically in a law enforcement capacity, it was post the invasion. I was responsible for interface and running security, really law enforcement for the city of Panama, which is pretty major, large city.
Mhm.
So it was really interesting. It was an interesting MOS. I enjoyed the soldiers that I worked with. Again, great deployments. We went to Saudi Arabia and Iraq, where I handled area security, prisoners of war. I went to Guantanamo Bay, where our work was with the Haitian migrants. More unusual circumstance when the U.S. was diverting them there, and we were housing them there while figuring out what was the best outcome or the best way to handle it. So yeah, I really did enjoy. Really did enjoy being an MP.
So based off of that original lesson of get your team to be successful and how did you implement that in your time as MP?
So it was interesting because when I arrived, when I arrived at my first active duty unit after being commissioned, and of course I had served in the National Guard, so it was unusual for the commander because normally a second lieutenant arrives, they're fresh out of their officer basic course, and this is their first platoon leader assignment. I had already spent not only had I spent a couple of years in the National Guard as a platoon leader, but I had been the company commander of the college at Valley Forge. So I'd had 200 people in my charge with a full staff. So it was funny because I left my basic course. I arrived to my duty station and we sat down and we met for about a half hour. He told me he assigned me to the second platoon, and I went in to settle down the second platoon. They were clearly expecting me, right? The platoon sergeant and the squad leaders were there and started getting settled. And about 10 minutes later, the executive officer comes back in and says, the commander would like to see you again. So I go back to his office and he says, look, I've given it some more thought after meeting you. I'm going to assign you to the fourth platoon. And to be very clear, they haven't had a platoon leader in probably 2 or 3 years. They don't want a platoon leader. They're the most undisciplined group in the company. Everybody kind of avoids them. Congratulations. So I
Voluntold.
walk, I walk into the platoon office, Sean, and the platoon sergeant, nice guy, looks at me and goes, "What can I help you with, sir?" Right? Of course, because I had no reason to be there. And I said, "Well, actually, I've just been assigned as a platoon leader." I mean, they were in shock. Um, but I think to answer your question, the reality was they needed a platoon leader, didn't know they did because I think they were living through a combination of, okay, we didn't have a platoon leader, we didn't have an officer supporting us, and therefore we weren't getting anything we wanted, and they were getting more and more undisciplined. So I will tell you that, working, that platoon sergeant was incredible, and working with him and with the, squad leaders and leadership of the platoon, we turned the platoon around incredibly in the matter of a couple months, which we only had a couple months because we were going to Panama. I just didn't know that. I had orders for Ranger School post my officer basic course, and 2 weeks before I was done, my assignments officer called, and she said, your orders have been canceled. And I said, why? And she said, I don't know. You'd have to call your gaining commander. So come to find out, I arrived at the unit and we were deploying to Panama within about 6 weeks or 8 weeks.
Hmm. How did that deployment change you? That was your first deployment, right?
That was my first deployment. Well, no, I had actually done some time in Honduras
Mm-hmm.
when I was with the National Guard. But
Probably
first,
not as maybe kinetic as they say as Panama at that point.
fair enough, and not as extended. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
how did that time in Panama change you as a leader, change you as a person?
Well, anytime you're operating in a foreign country, especially immediately post the invasion, there's a lot of chaos. So I think what it did for me was, different than the invasion of Panama, which was a finite amount of time and fairly quickly, right?
Mhm.
Chaos there. This became sort of extended chaos. I think it made me more conscious of evaluating my national partners, I guess I would say, because one of the challenges we had in Panama was the police force post the invasion was filled with both Noriega sympathizers, frankly, and those opposed, and trying to determine who was who and who really had the best interests in mind. There's a lot of corruption. We were dealing with a lot of that. Ironically, we at the time also our operations were being run by Colonel Steele. You're young, probably not even remember, but Colonel Steele was a close friend of Oliver North's.
Mhm.
Colonel Steele was up for a star, never got a star, largely due to that. So there was a lot of, political influence going on in the country at the same time. So it really allowed me, from a leadership perspective, to hone down to my soldiers what was important and really shut out the noise, because there was a lot of noise when we were there. There was a lot of rumors about things that were happening, wasn't happening, infiltration into the police forces we were supporting. So it allowed me to really to benefit also from the leadership of my platoon sergeant, who had been around at that point in the Army for well over 20 years, and really coordinate with them. So I was a big believer in, and I think I learned this at Valley Forge. Uh, Officers bring a certain strategic way of thinking to the table, but your senior NCOs bring that experience to the table. And I learned that from my mentor, Sergeant Major Dede. So we always had a good relationship. I was very willing to come in and go, hey, look, here's what I know, and it's this much, and here's what I don't know, and it's a lot. And help me grow here, and let's make each other successful. So I think that understanding and appreciating your NCO ranks and what other leaders below you may have expertise in
Mhm.
continued to humble me as a leader moving forward.
Uh, and it really hits home how crucial we're going to keep hitting that word leadership is, because this unit was like you said, sort of starting to become a little too loose.
Oh, they
Uh,
were way too loose.
right. And you don't have a platoon leader, but like, and a company can do that as well. It doesn't just become like Lord of the Flies, but it certainly is like they don't have that person that sort of gets them on all the right track, correct?
Yeah, and it's funny because it also, in its own way, creates a unique sense of camaraderie.
Hmm.
I was working with the group. I'll bring this back. I was with a group last week in a major corporation, a name you would know, and uh, at the end of each day of each program, I always ask people to write down one thing that resonated and share it with the team, and it's a reinforcement of sort of what they think will work for them. And at the end of it, somebody asked me for the first time. Somebody said, "What resonated with you about this group?" And I said, "Thank you for asking." I said, "I'm trying to understand how this group is so tight with each other, because I've seen that over the last couple of days,
Hmm.
yet you've only been together for about 3 months." So I said, I'm really trying to reconcile and understand that. And the most senior person said, the reality is it's been a really tough road, right? We've been pulled together to try to get at a business problem that no one had any advice on. We've taken a lot of licks, but we've supported each other. And I said to them, I'm not necessarily a proponent of this. I don't want to come off that way. But what I have learned is, when you put a group in a situation where there's a lot of adversity and at times a lot of suffering, the camaraderie that develops quickly is pretty amazing. And I think for me, I've seen that numerous times. I saw it when I went to military school, because that's frankly one of the ways they try to do that. They try to make life miserable so you will all come together, and that happens. But I saw it with the platoon in Panama. We did a good job of coming together before we deployed, but the reality is, once we were there and the situation was adverse and we were facing real challenges, everybody really stepped up to help each other. And I saw it tenfold when I took that same group to Saudi Arabia and Iraq, where I think we beyond excelled in comparison to the rest of the groups there, because the group had lived through an adversity that was the result of them believing they were sort of outcasts. So there was this sort of camaraderie of, the island of misfit toys
Yeah.
sort of thought process. And I think I was able to capitalize on that, right? And take it, from here to here. So it was great.
I like that Island of Misfit Toys as opposed to Lord of the Flies. It's a very different story.
Oh, yeah.
That works. How did your leadership support you and promote your success? Because giving you that assignment, I'm sure it was daunting and exhausting in a lot of ways. But then you get to Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and then you say they're excelling. Did your leadership notice this?
Yeah, and you know what? I think it's important to understand different leadership styles. We had a commander that drove us incredibly hard,
Hmm.
which you can do for a limited amount of time, right? And we were within that time frame. I will tell you that when he transitioned command, I knew the next person was going to have a tough road, because you can only drive people so hard. And I use some of, I share when I'm doing leadership and management development. I kind of share with folks, you can only drive people super hard for a certain amount of time. You've got to understand what that breaking point is and when you need to give them a break.
Mhm.
But he was incredibly supportive, especially from the standpoint of recognizing the strengths that I had and playing to those strengths, specifically when it came to certain assignments. And I think he did that with all of us as subordinate leaders. He understood and knew, both from being good enough to ask, right, number one,
Mhm.
but also observation, to be able to say, this leader is really good at this. And when those assignments came, he was very thoughtful about where to put them. That also had an impact on me in my professional career outside the military, because I started looking, going, in the future, I want to be someone that my manager or leader is comfortable with me doing any of those things. So I very much look at my career progression and my skills and say, I'm a master of a few things, but I'm dangerous enough in almost everything.
Right.
So I can go into an executive meeting. It really plays well in my executive coaching. And before I'll share this. Early in my corporate career, I had a boss who said to me, look, you know what the requirements and responsibilities are of your job. As long as you're doing those and completing those successfully, if there are other things you want to be involved in, just let me know and we'll talk about it. And I got to tell you, Sean, I overtook advantage of that. I was like, hey, look, I don't have any finance experience. I need a couple. Are there any major projects going on with finance that I can either sit in on or be part of? Okay, we got that. And so I developed this reputation in my career of, I could sit in an executive meeting and any topic that came up, I could speak intelligently to it.
Mhm.
And now as an executive coach, because now as an executive coach, I coach people in different functions, right? I
Mhm.
coach different functional leaders, commercial, human resources, finance. I coach folks in all those areas because I have enough of an understanding of their functional area
Mhm.
that allows me to be able to coach them. So I think that's really important for a long-term career, is knowing that, understanding different functions, at least at a
Mhm.
baseline, is really important, because you're going to find yourself as you move up in meetings where you're not all within your function, right? In fact, there one or two from every function.
That is you're a very unique person in that way, because to be able to take the bull by the horns a lot of these areas and say, I'm going to learn as much as I can about as much as I can to
Mhm.
further my career, especially at such a young age, and being exposed to so much. And the military really, it seems like the military, your leadership there really gave you a lot of breadth to say, this guy knows what he's doing, has the drive, has the will. Let me know what you want to do. And, we're going to support you in that.
Yeah, and I've always been, leadership is a never-ending journey.
Yeah.
I consider myself, first and foremost, I am a student of leadership. And I've always felt that way. So I'm always looking for, anything I can get my hands on, read, documentary, anything that sort of continues to educate, observing others, understanding. I do a lot of what we call diagnostic work in my business. So in fact, it's where a call I was on before ours, where I was talking to a new client, and we're talking about, how many interviews will I do with their leaders? I'm going to probably do 25 to 30 interviews of an hour each. Gives me a real feel for What are the organizational challenges? What do these leaders know? What do they need development in? What are their strengths? What are their, what are their areas of development? So I'm just a big proponent of, if you are a leader, you have to be a student of leadership, and you have to be that there's no finish line, right? We can always develop and get better as leaders, and we can always learn more.
If you're reflective on that time, what would you say was probably your biggest weakness as a leader? And was it just that big amount that you didn't know, or what would you say was that?
I'll admit it was my ego.
Hmm.
I had been a leader again in both, in high school, in some school groups, as well as external to high school and in external groups. And then I get to Valley Forge. Well, then I get awarded the scholarship, right? I finished first in my class there. Then I go to Valley Forge, and I am like, okay, what's the role I want in my second year? Well, to me, it was the company commander of the college, right? I got that role. So I had a lot of confidence, Sean. And where it all came to a head for me was the morning we were deploying to Saudi Arabia and supported Desert Shield. Now, we had gone to Panama. We had tremendous success there. Feedback had been great. I had won, the awards, and the organization had gotten, tremendous feedback. And so it's the morning we're deploying, and we're standing outside, and all my soldiers, 30 at the time, 30 men, were standing in front of me. And we're getting ready to leave to go to Andrews Air Force Base, get on the plane. And I see behind my platoon all of their family members, right? Their fathers, mothers, their wives, significant others, children. And I walked to the back of the platoon. Many of them I knew. We were a very tight-knit group back then. And I walked to the back of the platoon to address them. And I, in that moment, said, please write. We'll keep you as updated as we can. And I looked at everyone, and in a moment of tremendously poor judgment, Sean, I said, I promise to bring your husbands, your sons, and your fathers home alive.
Yeah.
And I regretted it as soon as I said it. And I lived 6 months every day thinking about that promise. Fortunately, I was able to keep it, but it was the greatest ego check I had ever had. I was like, for me to believe at 23 years old at the time, that I was that infallible, right? That I was that great a leader, was a real learning experience. I give myself some grace, as much as I punish myself for it on a regular basis, that, I was a young kid and I had a lot of success. The accolades were pretty significant, but it taught me a huge lesson about no matter how good you are, or no matter how positive you want to be, don't ever make a promise to somebody that you can't keep, and that's a pretty significant one.
Interesting that you say that, because I talked a little bit here about one of our guests on the other VBC program we did. Ralph White, banker, went to Vietnam, fall of Saigon, had employees that he was trying to get out during that phase. And the most emotional he got during his story was the point where he said to one of his employees, "I'm not going to leave you behind." And he knew that he probably couldn't keep that promise. He said, "I regretted it as soon as I said it," but it was that, a young guy who knew what was coming for them in South Vietnam thought, like, "I'm going to get you out," because he just, like you said, sort of had that ego of like, "Yeah, I'm going to do this." And thankfully he did. But he said, I regretted it as soon as I said it. And it's, that sort of put you on the spot. It put you in, that you are now in charge of somebody's life, and you want to make sure to follow through with that. I'm sure that was
yeah, and part of it comes from, certainly I want to be, it was because I cared so much. It was because
totally.
I could feel what they felt. But the reality is I made that statement because I thought I guess in the moment I thought I could keep it. And even worse was on the day the ceasefire was called, when we were over in tent, was lunchtime. Myself and a couple other of my fellow officers, peers, and we had the small transistor radio hanging from the tent pole, and Armed Forces Network was playing, and they announced the ceasefire, and we had barely had an opportunity for it to sink in, and the ground shook and there was an explosion. We knew the explosion was within our camp, and as we grabbed our helmets and our weapons, I'm running out thinking, oh my gosh, I just thought I had a moment of, oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to keep my promise.
Hmm.
And now I don't know if that's the case now. Luckily for me, the soldiers that were injured in the explosion in the camp were not mine. They
Hmm.
were within our unit, but not my soldiers. So, but again, right at that moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to. I've lived 6 months thinking, why did I make that promise? I'm going to be able to keep it, and just like that, it came into question again.
And I think there's the other side of that coin as well. That if I were a soldier in that unit, I would want my leader to be, to have that confidence of,
Confidence.
yeah, that high
Yeah.
level of and yes, that puts all the pressure on you, but that's also like if you're like, hey, we might come back. I mean, you want your leader to say,
Sure.
we're going to get the job done and we're coming home.
Yeah, and you want to do it in a way that's realistic.
Yeah.
I think people take solace in that, right? They
Mhm.
want to know that, but my approach now after learning that lesson is, I want my folks to always know I'm going to do whatever I possibly can.
Mhm.
No stone unturned, no lack of effort will ever apply when it comes to them, my employees, those that I'm responsible for.
I like that over the course of our conversation of just diving into your service, that we're getting a really good feel for what your post service was all about. A lot about leadership, a lot about what that
Yeah.
was. So lead me through sort of that military to corporate transition that you made. You get out of the military, and you took on this very strong trajectory in your life. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so at that time, military recruiting firms were becoming pretty popular. So I linked up with one and got placed at Johnson and Johnson in a sales role in the pharmaceutical sector. Not a job I just let you know and be admit, not a job I loved. I didn't really like the space, that end of things, and so I got really lucky. I made a couple connections at Johnson and Johnson, and somebody called and said, "Hey, look, we're looking at creating this new department at J&J headquarters in New Jersey to centralize sales recruiting for the U.S. If I'll move you up here, and if it works, great, you got a job. If it doesn't work, at least you're moved up here." And I was eligible at that point for promotion to a manager, anyways. So it did work out. The department was successful. I eventually took it over from the person I'd started it with, and that gave me exposure. The greatest thing about that job was because my role supported all three sectors at Johnson and Johnson, so consumer products, pharmaceuticals, and device. I got exposure to the entire organization. It kind of gave me an option to pick where I wanted to go next because I had built these, I had so many relationships I was able to build, and
Hmm.
I wanted to move into the medical device sector. So that's essentially what it is. But the other thing I did do while I was running recruiting is I significantly expanded Johnson and Johnson's hiring of military folks coming out, both at the enlisted ranks and at the officer ranks. It was sort of my way to kind of give back, and there was a lot of need, and these are tremendous individuals to hire.
Hmm.
So I was able to put some programs in place, and it's great now. Sean, it's 30 years later. I mean, it's funny. Working at Medtronic about, I guess it was about 10 years ago, and we bought this other massive organization, and I'm looking at the leadership list, and the head of the sales group for the entire company that we bought was one of the guys I had first interviewed
Yeah.
when I was running recruiting. So it's a small industry, and I do run across those folks quite a bit,
Hmm.
and so that's really interesting. But yeah, so and then from the recruiting space, I kind of had my pick. So I went to the medical device side, did some sales operations time. I was a sales manager in New York City for about 5.5 years. That was a great experience. Really important to understanding business as a whole. I think being a first line sales manager is one of the most important roles for folks in the business sector if they're going to be touching commercial.
Hmm.
Um, and then things just sort of, I kept my eyes open. Things sort of came my way. I made some transitions to get some more functional experience. I moved to training for a while. I took a marketing job. I always tell people it's great to know what you're not good at. I'll never have to wonder if I would have loved a career in marketing because I hated it and I was bad at it. So I did that for a year, and I'm like, okay, good, check that box. Not something I want to do, right?
Yeah.
So did some time in training, and then also really focused on my developing my own education as well.
Hmm.
Got my master's in education late in life and things like that.
How did you then transition to consulting and really looking at like zeroing in on, I'm going to help build better leaders?
Yeah, so my last 8 years was primarily at that point, I was a leader, I was a learning and development functional leader, right? I mean, that was my sort of chosen, that was the function I settled in on, was learning and development. And I was, and my passion was leadership and management development. So I began to get an opportunity to develop large scale learning and management development programs, because that was my passion, and began to be able to interact with folks who they were passionate about as well. Started learning from those groups. When Medtronic approached me, and it was sort of like I'd been in a pretty big learning and development job, and it was time for me to get promoted, and it included, the prospect of that included a move to Minneapolis. It was not something I wanted to do at the time. So I was now faced with this decision of, okay, do I want to go do the same job again at another organization, which did not really jazz me at that point, right? Although there were plenty of opportunities, because senior leaders in learning and development in my space it's a small group of us, right? More opportunities than actually folks that are qualified.
Yeah.
But it was at that point that a company by the name of Matrix Achievement Group, who I had been a client of, actually they were a consultant, that group that I used, came to me and said, hey, look, considering you're looking for opportunities, and we know leadership and management development is your passion, we could really use that expertise in our firm. Would you be willing to to start with us with a project? And that project, Sean, was like a dream come true. It was essentially, I got 6 months to look at all the research over the last 50 years for leadership and management development, from academia, corporate, meta-analyses, all of this data and research, and then devise a leadership and management development program. It was like a dream come true. And so that's when I made that transition. And then since then, I've sort of expanded my portfolio of offerings, became certified as an executive coach, even though I've been doing a lot of one-on-one coaching, because it is important, for it to have a certification. And that's sort of where I was off to the races. So I'm really fortunate now that the last 6 or 7 years, and as that time's gone on, even more focus of mine is on leadership and management development.
Whenever you sit down with somebody in these one-on-ones, what skills are you looking to build? Are you looking to get like a full picture, a holistic sort of idea of who they are, what their position is in the company, and as you said earlier, figure out sort of what leadership they need in that department?
So I start with, normally I'll conduct some sort of assessment. That can be done in like a 360 survey. To be frank, I prefer one-on-one interviews. So I may take let's say you were a senior leader in an organization. I'm going to speak to your boss, who most of the time for me is going to be the president or the CEO. If I'm coaching the CEO, it'll be the members of the board. I'm going to interview a couple peers, get their feedback, and then I'm going to interview some subordinates. I'm going to try to piece together some themes of what's this person really good at. What are some of the things this person could work on? Then I'm going to ask them the exact same questions that I asked the people I interviewed. It tells me a lot about their self-awareness, but also tells me if maybe their leadership is telling them what's wrong or what isn't, or what's good and what isn't, right? I find that a lot, unfortunately, where I interview somebody that I'm going to be coaching, and they've never been told by their leader what they do well, what they need to improve. And then from there, Sean, we will devise sort of a short list of, here are the things they want to develop. Sometimes that becomes sort of the majority of what we'll talk about over the 6 or 12-month engagement. Typically, it's a minimum of 6. Some people I've been with as long as a year and a half. But other times it's really what's happening in the moment. So we may have a plan, but very common that I'll get on my call with them, which is an hour every other week, and we do it in this setting on Zoom. And they'll say, "Look, I don't know. There's something I got to talk to you about. There's a challenge I'm facing, or this has come up." Right. What I do find with high performers, because what I do love about executive coaching is it used to be a tool for, hey, this person's on their way out. Can we fix them? And it was a waste of money and really shouldn't have been handled that way. Now it's really, hey, we've got this high potential person. We want to continue to develop them. So a lot of times the discussions are, around, here's a challenge I'm facing. I'm not sure what angle to go at it. So we talk a lot about that. And then I do find with really high performers, they don't give themselves enough credit. So I find myself stopping. I was on the phone with somebody yesterday. She's an amazing performer. And I found myself again having to stop and go, whoa, whoa, wait. Before you blow past that, I need you to stop and I need you to tell me how you feel about that success. And she was very apprehensive. I'm like, no, no, no. You need to revel in that. Give yourself credit, right? I know you don't want to do that, and I'm not asking you to do it at length or at nauseum, but you have to stop and recognize for yourself when you're doing work that's good and the
Yeah.
successes are happening. So, to be honest, Sean, I had one person I coached that for 2 months, all we talked about was the fact that his brother was living in his house and how disruptive it was to his life. And the reality, though, was significantly impacting his work.
Yeah.
So we spent 2 months talking about that, and eventually it netted out where we got on the phone one day and I said, how did your discussion go? And he said it went okay, and he's moving out. I think we're both going to move on from this scenario. But the organization's making that investment in that person because they want them to be at their best.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's what's impacting them, which is what was at that time for this person, then that's what we're going to talk about.
It's like you had to go get a degree in social work in some way as well, because
A
you're
little bit of
dealing with,
counseling.
right? Yeah, you're not just dealing with
Yeah.
like, hey, let's figure out the leadership style that you need to help you succeed and your team succeed, but it's also like you as a person, what is your roadblock? What is stopping you from being the best version of yourself in this role?
And in that, what you just said, Sean, is a great description of what leaders should be doing, right? Leaders should be sitting down and saying, what's getting in your way, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the challenges you're facing? What's getting in your way?
Brings me to a good question, maybe. What happens? What happens when the thing that's getting in the way of making a good leader is the management of that leader?
Well, I'm at an advantage as an external consultant, and it's a funny thing. It really is. And I knew this when I was in industry and dealing with consultants. We have the ability to be really open and honest and tell the painful things. It's really nice because it wasn't like this when I was in corporate. It's not something you just kind of have to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And you just kind of have to work around it. Now, I'm also a big believer, Sean, in that, absolutely. First of all, we learn more from our failures than our successes. We learn more from our difficult situations than the ones that were easy. That's just as human beings in our nature and our biology, we know that to be true. The adversity you face with poor leaders and poor managers, I believe, will teach you more. And in fact, when I spend more time when developing or running programs for current or new leaders, I spend more time talking about, let's identify the things you've seen you don't like, because it makes them more capable of making sure they don't do those things. So I do love that. So there's a lot to be learned from that. But when you are in that situation in a corporate environment, you kind of just have to work around it. Maybe you get lucky and somebody at a higher level figures it out and eventually comes to you and your team and says, hey, we're trying to understand how y'all feel about so-and-so, right? And all gloves are off. But as a consultant, I can go to people and I can tell them, and I have. I coached somebody a couple of years ago where their boss was the president and the CEO. And I kind of I knew from the interview with the CEO about this person, I had some questions things didn't line up. Mm-hmm. And eventually over time, and not to say that the person I coached, they were, a senior VP at the organization. They had some things they obviously could develop, but I eventually had to go to the manager and the CEO and say, look, I need to talk about some things that are coming out in some of these discussions. And I want to validate that what I'm hearing first is correct, right? So I started sort of with the facts, did this transpire that way? And then I was able to ask, why did you feel it was beneficial to react that way? Or what was your thought process? Where I can eventually come to, part of the challenge that I think you're experiencing here is, you're not being respectful to this person's, time, and therefore it's creating conflict. But it is nice being I'm not gonna lie, it's really nice being in that position to be able to say that and not worry about it impacting your career.
Yeah,
right. I mean,
absolutely.
they could not hire me again. I mean, that would impact me, but it's not like, not like losing your job. Like you can't do that. And, a lot of people aren't comfortable in that, but I will tell you that I have a pretty thick skin and I've learned to be fairly bold and hopefully somewhat political savvy.
Yeah.
That, as I got higher in organizations later in my corporate career, when I wasn't a consultant, I usually could broach topics of like, this isn't making. I need to share something with you. Are you open to it? Are you open to listening? Because it's not going to be positive. And then being able to say, this is the way this is making me feel. I don't know what your intent is, but I do need you to know this is the way it's coming off. Do you think that's reasonable? Do you think the way I'm taking it is reasonable? It at
Hmm.
least makes people think.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
I'm also careful to know not everybody's comfortable doing that. So I,
Mhm.
I get that.
Well, there's that difference between like good managers, bad managers, and toxic managers. And I like that
Yes.
your approach is not just to say, okay, I'm contracted to work with this one person about becoming a better leader, but to really take that idea of like, let's look at the whole shebang and
Yeah.
really develop this organizational leadership. That maybe the person above you, there's conflict there as opposed to just this person's working with their team.
Right. And because I'm a consultant, I'm privy to people are more open and honest. So I have one client now that I started by coaching two of their folks, but they've come to a place now where they're like, well, you know so much about the intricacies and inner workings of organization, both the good and the bad. We
Mm-hmm.
don't want to lose that. We want to leverage that. What else do you see as potential opportunities for development? And I can give that insight.
So this is all through about face development.
It is.
I'd love to hear what that story was. Why'd you decided to call that?
Yeah, so where is it? So back in the late 80s, um, a gentleman by the name of David Hackworth wrote the book About Face.
Mhm.
And David at the time was considered, or Hack as most people refer to him, he was considered the most decorated living veteran. And he had enlisted, lied on his birth certificate to enlist in the military. He had served in Korea. He had served multiple tours in Vietnam. Very controversial figure because it was David Hackworth who appeared on Issues and Answers, and was the one who sort of went on television and said our approach in Vietnam is all wrong.
Mhm.
You know, he was a guy destined for potentially for chief of staff of the army, and his career ended very abruptly. Well, I read About Face right before, after I'd been commissioned, but right before I went on active duty, and it was incredibly, incredibly impactful to me. My peers and I talked about it. So I wrote to Colonel Hackworth, sent him a letter, and just said, "Look, I'm getting ready to go on active duty. I can't tell you how important your book was to me. It's a roadmap for understanding the importance of training your folks well and preparedness and dealing with units like I ended up with, Sean, right?
Mhm.
He has a lot of stories about getting units that are completely in the wrong place." And he wrote me back. And that started a friendship between Hack and I that lasted a couple decades. And
Mhm.
he was, again, a controversial figure. He had moved to Australia for a while, and then he came back to the U.S. Did a lot of press. He was on CNN a lot. He was a reporter in the field. He wrote a lot for Newsweek, but it was it was sort of one of those, when people say be leery of meeting your heroes. I was fortunate that I didn't feel that way. He had a huge influence on me, and we stayed in touch. He did almost get me kicked out of my advanced course. We were in a class that was entitled Combat Stress. And the instructor at the time was a non-combat vet. And there were a couple of us who had done at least one tour, if not more, combat assignments. And somebody brought up Hack's name, which was pretty common back then. He was still being talked about a lot because of the book. And the instructor basically made a disparaging comment
Mhm.
about him. So, of course, not thinking twice, in my monthly letter to Hack, I mentioned it. And next thing I know, I'm getting called into the commandant's office at the MP school because Hack called and apparently went absolutely ballistic on the commandant. And of course, I'm standing there, and they're going. Now, he of course didn't say who repeated it, but there is a rumor that you and him are friends, assuming it was you. And it almost ended my military career. To be very frank with you,
Wow.
I was fortunate to recover, but I remember writing to him, going, I know you can fly off the handle, Hack, but like, give some thought to, you're out and I'm still in.
Yeah.
And everybody knew. And of course, his response was, "I don't understand how they knew it was you." I'm like, they knew it was me, right? I talk about you nonstop. So, in any event, next to the passing of my father, I was he was one of the most sad days of my life when he passed away. It was fortunate. He passed away close enough to Veterans Day that he was actually buried and interned on Veterans Day at
Mm.
Arlington, which was an
Wow.
incredible experience. So yeah, so that's the story behind About Face Development. One person that I ran into at a trade show, who's also an ex-veteran, approached me and said, "I have a question to ask. Is there any chance you named your company after Hackworth?" And I said, "Yeah." And thanks for picking that up. So yeah, it's a great man. He was a great
Wow.
man.
Pat, how does someone contract you?
Yeah, so Pat at About Face Dev. So it's abbreviation for About Face Development. So aboutfacedev.com. I have a website, aboutfacedevelopment.com. And or LinkedIn is the easiest way to find me as well. It's Pat D'Amico. There's not too many of us around. It's D'Amico.
Excellent. We will have all of those links down here in the description. So if you're listening or you're watching on YouTube, just scroll down. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell on YouTube so you're the first to know whenever the Scuttlebutt releases new episodes. Thank you for joining us, Pat, for this excellent conversation. And I wish you nothing but the best. I hope to have you on again on the Scuttlebutt. It was wonderful stories. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it.
Of course.